While having a business architecture in place can certainly be very useful in helping you to create and understand requirements and objectives, we have once again left an important omission out. How do we create a business architecture in the first place? Well, if you're lucky, maybe your company already has one, or perhaps there's even a full-time business architect on staff that you can interface with and perhaps work with to build one that suits your needs. If not, though, it's still possible for the business analyst to create one using the raw materials and assets that we discussed just a few moments ago. To do so, you should ask yourself the following questions. First, what approach should be used? This is most important if we're talking about a complex enterprise, one where there are many moving pieces, perhaps some of which could be considered to be definitively outside the scope of what's being investigated. Therefore, perhaps we can get away with just modeling a single division or line of business, or a certain product if we are a more productized organization. In those cases, we can work around just that question, as opposed to trying to build a model of this conglomerate that has many different pieces that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other based on the question we're looking to answer. How the architecture will be used is the other portion of this question. If it's meant to look at the enterprise as a whole, then we need to model it as such. If, on the other hand, we're very limited in the scope of the questions we're trying to answer or the kind of issues we're trying to investigate, then a more limited architecture could be just as useful. Third, will the architecture model the present or the desired future state of the organization? It's entirely possible you may want to build both, in which case starting with the present version is normally easiest. However, if you're trying to create something wholly new, if you're trying to revolutionize a portion of your business, then in that case, you may want to start with that future state and then work backwards to better understand how the organization can adapt to that new model moving forward. If the architecture will describe the entire enterprise or a business line or a functional area is one of those questions that should be answered just as we spoke about. And then we have to also consider what informational resources will be needed and what informational resources are available to us. We want to make sure that what we need in order to build an effective model is something that we can obtain. Otherwise, we may need to make assumptions or try to simulate certain factors of the business that could impair the overall value of the model. So we should work to find what information we need and how we can go about obtaining as accurate and up-to-date information as possible in these areas. What tools and resources are going to be needed in order to build the business architecture? If we're making one purely on paper, if we're just using process flows and organizational charts, different types of visualizations that aren't very dynamic in nature, then that's one thing. If, on the other hand, we're trying to introduce very complex simulations and real-time computer models into the equation, then we may need an entirely different suite of tools in order to accomplish that. Can we get access to these? Is it within the resource purview of the business and within your authority as a business analyst to find these or create them? Who will be involved in creating the architecture, and who will help to review its quality, accuracy, and usability? Business analysts don't develop business architectures in a vacuum. Rather, just like other portions of business analysis, this should be done in coordination with other stakeholders, who you may turn to for feedback, to work with directly on creating the business architecture, or at minimum, to run it by them, to make sure that they can validate it, and that what you see and what you've created lines up with their perspective of how the business truly operates. At the end, we have a series of desired results, regardless of the complexity of the business architecture we create. First, we want to compile all of the strategic plans and philosophies that have to do with the issue or opportunity that we're investigating. We want to include all of the organizational structure information that could be relevant and valuable here to understanding how the business operates and what might be impacted by any changes we could propose. We should include our goals and objectives for business units that are directly tied or perhaps even indirectly tied to the business, so long as they might be impacted. Function, service, process, role, and product details for all relevant business units should be included as well. We should understand the type of jobs that people do, how they do them, why they do them, what their role is within the overall process, and so on. Finally, we should include the results of gap analysis as it takes place, although this may not be readily available to us as we first develop the business architecture. Rather, this is something that we continue to add over time as we use the architecture as a tool and continue to refine it over the course of our analysis. Oftentimes, when we want to validate whether or not our business architecture will be a valuable and effective tool, we can use use cases and different business scenarios in order to learn and test this model, to learn more about the business and to test whether or not the architecture is functioning as we would desire it to. If we know from past data, for example, how certain scenarios would work out, if we can't turn to our business architecture and arrive at a very similar result, then perhaps we don't have a full understanding of the business, or perhaps key things have changed since that scenario originally took place. Having an appropriate modeling philosophy will vary by the business and the needs, so it depends on what you're trying to model here, and this is why bringing stakeholders in is so important. They'll have the best idea of how things really work on the ground, and you can use that information to build models that accurately represent reality. These models are often built around an organizational structure, but they can also be built around a certain activity or a function, such as a product line and how a product is developed from beginning to end. Regardless, you want to build your model in a way that'll be most useful to you when conducting your needs assessment and other business analysis activities.